Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Zachariah Renfro, and today we're going to do a very brief overview of the women of the medieval period. Most of this course we focused on a lot of thinkers, but they've almost all been exclusively men, and there were many reasons for that. A lot of it was societally enforced misogyny against women, and a lot of it was that very few men at the time were doing reading or writing or intellectual pursuits. We have to remember the literacy rate at this time was low, perhaps even down into the single digits. So we're talking a very, very small minority of people who are even able to read and write, let alone be able to read and write well enough to do philosophical analysis. The majority of men, even alive today, don't have the reading, writing, and thinking skills to do philosophical analysis, let alone the majority of women or whatever. It is just a matter of fact that people doing philosophy is a very, very narrow subset of society. And we find that the people who tend to do this tend to be people who dedicate their life to philosophy and not much else. Even all the way back in the time of Plato, we see that the people who were philosophers pretty much did philosophy and not much else. And of course, at the time, what was considered philosophy was a bit larger scope than today. But again, we're talking very small subset. So this is what we'll cover. And the thinkers that we'll cover here, this is a mile high overview. If you are interested in any of the women that I talk about today, I do encourage you to read the things that they wrote, to learn about their lives, because there's some interesting stuff here. And I wish I could cover it in a lot more detail, but due to time restraints, I've got to just try and go a little bit quickly over them. So if you see one that you really like I said, read the stuff they write, learn about them, and hopefully you'll find something interesting. When it comes to the medieval period, we got to remember that most of the women and most of the men are pretty much in the illiterate peasant class. And this is women and men. It is only in the very upper classes that we see things like ladies in waiting or women of the court, right? For most of the men and women that are below this ruling class, they are living in pretty much desperate poverty, hand to mouth, and they're all working. Once we get to the upper classes, then we see people getting some leisure time and getting to think about things. But in the lower classes, men and women are living a very similar style of life, which is poverty and constant physical labor. We also see that in these very upper classes, there are quite a few women who become empresses, queens, baronesses, and they're running countries or small city states or whatever. And there's quite a few of them. Their stories are all interesting. Some of their accomplishments, both military and societally, are interesting. And it's one of the reasons why, for example, in Europe, they tend to be much more comfortable with hiring female prime ministers or whatever because they already have a history of things like queens and baronesses or whatever who have ruled. Whereas, for example, here in the US, we don't have that, and it's created this kind of weird dichotomy. Some of the women of power, Theodora Byzantium, Joan of Arc, Matilda Tuscany, and like I said, a bunch of others. You can look them up at your leisure. We're focusing on the very few female thinkers that we have records of. And let me say this, there are probably more, again, especially among these upper classes. If we're talking about these people who are knights or servants of the king or whatever, there are probably quite a few different women who are educated and perhaps able to carry on philosophical conversations, but they just don't survive in writing. The few female thinkers we have do mostly deal with theological and or some political issues, and we do want to acknowledge them. We want to acknowledge that they were part of this time period and they had some things to say. Now, I will say, like I said, this is a very brief overview, so Don't expect a huge amount of detail as we go through. First, we've got Hildegard von Bingen. She is a German mystic, and she wrote the Scivias. The Scivias is a pretty interesting book. I've got it. I'll grab out my different female thinkers here. It's a pretty chunky volume here, and it covers her visions that she received from God, and she recounts a whole bunch of things of the different thinkers here. This is one of the more philosophically dense books the Scivias is. She talks about things body and soul, creation, quite a few different metaphysical topics. So definitely worth your time if you want a really detailed analysis. But I do warn you, if you are reading the Scivias, you need to make sure that you're kind of up to date on your understanding of the Bible, because there are a lot of references to things that are in the Bible. And if you're not very biblically well read, you might get a little lost. Next, we have Marie de France, who wrote Les Marie de France, which is one of the books that popularized chivalry and courtly love, right? And this becomes a whole genre of like writing. And by the time we get to the 1600s, we see Don Quixote, written by Cervantes, right? We see that by this point, it's already become like kind of old and tired, right? So she creates basically one of the trends of literature. This combined with Arthurian legend creates a whole genre of knights and ladies in waiting and chivalry. Whereas we have to remember most of these knights that were going around, they weren't guided by some kind of higher code. They were just soldiers for a king or a lord. So she really fantasizes this military lifestyle of the time. Next, we have Catherine of Siena. She is later canonized. She helps found hospitals. She works for the Pope as a diplomat, trying to get these various kings to respect the authority of Rome. And her dialogue on divine providence is her most famous work. I've got It's the dialogue of Sapphiric version, which includes her dialogue of divine providence, her treatise of discretion, her treatise of prayer, and her treatise of obedience. So it's a lot of her writings, not the entirety of her writings, but it's a big chunk of them all together in one. And she wrote a lot. She was a very motivated writer, and her writings can be pretty dense. So I do recommend that if you're going to try and study her, that you put some time and effort into it. Next, we have Julian of Norwich. She was a woman who basically lived as a hermit. She encloistered herself and tried to spend her life separated from others so that she could come closer to God. She wrote Revelations of Divine Love. She thought she was dying and she had these visions of Christ, and she wrote about the nature of sin and divine love. She wrote a short version and then she wrote a long version, which is got more explanations of the things that happen in the short version. We're not 100% sure if her name's Julian, and we don't know a whole lot about her life. I mean, that's kind of what happens when you're a hermit, right? People kind of forget about you. And at the time she died, it wasn't like some kind of big to do. She died, and then someone else moved into the room she was living in. This is the oldest surviving English work by a woman, and it's a very important historical finding. Not to say that other women weren't writing before her, because obviously, if she was able to write, other women were writing, just that we don't really have any records from these other women. A lot of times, because of paper scarcities, people might write something and then it might get more or less erased and covered up. So only what was considered the most important things were getting written, not like today, where we are just awash in paper scraps and writings. Then we have probably my favorite female thinker, Christine de Pizan. She was a professional writer and advisor to politicians, and her writings are not nearly as metaphysically deep as the other women that we've looked at. But her book of City Ladies is very strong arguments against misogyny of the time, which I find kind of interesting, kind of neat to think about. And she also wrote a book of three virtues, which was a practical guide for women of the time. If I'm remembering correctly, de Pizan ended up poor early on, had some calamities happening earlier in her life, and she had to basically survive and take care of her kids on her own, and that's where she went into being a writer. And she was apparently very successful on it and eventually was able to advise politicians and become a bit of a local celebrity. Then we have Margery Kempe, who, if we want to think about it, is really kind of the beginning of what you might consider the charismatic movement in Christianity. She wrote the first English autobiography, the Book of Margery Kempe, and it is a spiritual recounting of her life. She was constantly having these visions and constantly talking about the role of women in the world. And she spent a lot of time challenging the church patriarchy, and she was tried for heresy several times. She would be out in the street preaching, which was against the law for women to be preaching in the street. And she'd have these really frantic events where she would be crying and rolling around on the ground and screaming in prayer. And many people felt unnerved, and people would come listen to her sermons and find themselves rededicating their life to religion and all that. It very interesting, and her writings are they're pretty wild, at least from what I've read. So definitely look her up if you want to see a very interesting view. So we see that although the roles of women were limited, there were some influential women of the time, and much of the female thought we see has been focused on religious topics, right? But so was most of the male thought at the time. That was just the zeitgeist of the period. A lot of very heavy focus on Christian theology and Christian philosophy, and these people were making contributions as best they could, which I definitely find interesting. And I definitely encourage you, if you found any of the women that I've talked about in this very short lecture interesting, look them up, read what they wrote, and come to get to know them because they do have some interesting things to say.